Okay, so I'm Elias Muhanna. I'm assistant professor of Comp Lit here at Brown. We are live right now. We're webcasting this, and I'm really thrilled to introduce my dear friend Ahmad Al-Jallad, a graduate school buddy of mine, who is here to talk about digital approaches to ancient literacy, the case of Safaitic. Ahmad is a university lecturer in Semitic Linguistics at Leiden. You have his full bio here, and in Middle East studies, we have a tradition where we don't do introductions, especially if we hand out an introduction. So I'm not going to tell you all about where he got his PhD and all that stuff. But I will say though that Ahmed's work is very exciting to me. We've been having conversations about language, linguistics, history, prehistory, since we were in graduate school together, and I've been terrifically excited about this area of research, not knowing that much about it, trying to educate myself just to kind of keep up with his own scholarship, and I think this is going to be a terrific talk. So Ahmed will speak for whatever it is, half an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A discussion, and yeah. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elias, for that kind introduction. And I really mean it. I'm usually embarrassed when the whole biography is read out. And thank you all for coming. And I'm aware that I'm standing in the way of pizza, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. But I want to thank first Elias for inviting me here and be able to speak with all of you about Safaitic. And I imagine for many, Safaitic, this is the first time you're hearing this term. It's an exciting field of study, but it's in its infancy. I would say that the inscriptions were discovered more than 150 years ago, but a critical mass of scholars working on them, I think, was only achieved in the last 5 years. And so we're coming up with a lot of really interesting discoveries in this field. And Safaitic is it's a term that refers to an alphabet, a South Semitic alphabet. It's an alphabetic tradition used in the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, throughout Arabia, from the Syrian desert all the way to Yemen, you had a family of indigenous alphabets, indigenous scripts used before Islam, from the pre-Islamic, as early perhaps as the early or the late 2nd millennium BCE. And these alphabets are preserved mostly in the form of rock inscriptions. And Arabia seems to be unique in the ancient world in the number of inscriptions that have been produced, mostly in what scholars call graffiti. It's impossible to know how many inscriptions there are out there, but so far the known corpus is around between maybe almost 60,000 texts. And many of these are graffiti. And why is that important? Because they're not commissioned by state actors, they're not commissioned texts. They imply, or it seems to be the case, that they imply mass literacy, or literacy among nomads, among townspeople, and these are found all over the Arabian Peninsula. So even in the deepest deserts, we find text can only be written by nomads. So Arabia seems to have been a place of incredible literacy. Now, this has been the assumption. This is what people have thought, based on the number of texts and based on their distributions. What I want to do in this talk is sort of challenge that idea. We now have many of these texts, not all of them, but many of them in a database, and we can look at the entire corpus in ways that we haven't been able to study before. Before, these were in dispersed editions, some of them of poor quality, some of them really hard to attain, to get a hold of, and it was really impossible to study the entire corpus as a corpus. So it did seem like there were just many inscriptions everywhere and everyone could read and write. What I'm going to argue in this talk today is when we look at the entire corpus in the database with just a little bit of arithmetic, it's not so clear-cut, and maybe literacy wasn't as widespread as we thought. But before that, I want to give you sort of an introduction to the significance of these texts from the point of view of the history of Arabic, the Arabic language. So before the 20th century, Arabic's history began in the 6th century CE. That was as old as you could go. And the earliest Arabic texts were in fact poems that were transmitted orally and collected in the Islamic period. The first Arabic texts appeared in the 7th century. The surveying, the epigraphic surveying of Arabia in the late 19th and early 20th century extended Arabic's history back more than 1,000 years. So what was previously Arabic's prehistory became Arabic's history. And now we have tens of thousands of texts in languages that are rather exotic and far away from Arabic to those that are actually quite similar to classical Arabic. So the discovery of these texts, and Safaitic being one of them, has in a way turned Arabic's prehistory into history. And another thing is exciting. When we see, we filled up the linguistic map of Arabia, and we see that the position of text, the geographic location of texts that are in a language similar or related, most closely related to the Arabic that we know from Islamic times and even till today, cluster in northwest Arabia and the Syrian desert, Jordan, the southern Levant. This, from the point of view of traditional sources, turns the map of Arabic upside down. In traditional accounts, Arabic was always said to come from Yemen and disperse out and move northwards, but the epigraphic map looks completely the opposite. So these are just some of the kinds of really revolutionary discoveries that epigraphy has made in the last century. Arabic in the pre-Islamic period was written in a lot of scripts, a lot of different scripts. You have it in the Nabatean Aramaic script, in various forms of the South Arabian script, the South Semitic alphabet. So this is a Thamudic text, Thamudic alphabet that expresses Arabic language. This is Hismaic that expresses Arabic language, and these are Safaitic texts that express dialects of Arabic. So we see that there wasn't one script, one writing tradition associated with Arabic. It was written with many scripts, and sometimes, very, very rarely, we even get Arabic written in Greek letters. And this is tremendously valuable because we can say something about the vocalization of the language. We can pronounce it. Semitic scripts don't write the vowels. Greek does. We can talk about how Arabic was actually pronounced. This text here probably comes from the 3rd or 4th century CE. If we look at the area where Arabic is concentrated, like I said, it roughly coincides with the Nabatean kingdom. Right? The kingdom of the Nabateans and the basically ends in the early 2nd century CE, and it's located, you have the borders here, located in northwestern Arabia and the southern Levant. And in the settled areas, the inhabitants, although they spoke Arabic, wrote in the Aramaic script, and the nomads as well seem to have spoken Arabic, but they wrote their Arabic language in both the Safaitic alphabet and the Hismaic alphabet. And this talk today is going to focus on the Safaitic script and the inscriptions produced in that, in what we call the Harra, the basalt desert of southern Syria and northern Jordan, and it extends even to northern Saudi Arabia. Now, this is what the landscape looks like in the area, and these are Safaitic inscriptions. This photograph I actually took when Elias and I were doing field work earlier this year in northern Jordan, surveying and collecting inscriptions. And you can see that you have these endless lands, this almost billions and billions of basalt rocks, many of them inscribed with texts that you see here, or sometimes rock art. And you can walk, one day we walked perhaps 6 hours and found barely anything. The next day you might come across a cairn that has thousands of texts associated with it. And the exact patterns and distributions of why texts appear in some places and not others is not quite understood yet, but it is something that I think will become clearer once we study the database as a whole. Now, these texts are inscribed on these basalt rocks in the Safaitic alphabet. The Safaitic alphabet is a script from the South Semitic family that I mentioned earlier. It has 28 consonants, and there's no fixed direction of writing. Authors can write left to right to left, boustrophodon, that is to go back and forth. They can write in spirals, going inwards, beginning inwards, spiraling outward, basically in any direction they wish. You can write any way you like. There are no vowel letters and no word dividers. So if you didn't know the language, you wouldn't know where one word ended and one began, and you don't have all of the phonetic material present in the writing system. All the vowels, long and short, are missing, right? So you have a really defective writing system, but all the consonants are represented. The language of the Safaitic script is not uniform. You have a continuum of Arabic dialects. So some that are very close to classical Arabic and some that are quite different from it. There are different linguistic features across the whole corpus, and the dialect boundaries, drawing dialect boundaries and trying to figure out where certain dialects might have been spoken, certain others has not been worked out yet, mainly because the people who wrote these texts were mobile. They were nomads. And so, of course, you can get in one location a tremendous amount of variation. Now, we don't know how old the Safaitic inscriptions are. Some Safaitic inscriptions, a very small minority of them, are dated. And the ones that are dated tend to refer to events involving the Nabatean kingdom. So an inscription may be dated to the year the king of Nabatea died. We don't know which king. It could be the 3rd century BC, for example. And then the latest inscriptions seem to refer to events as late as the 2nd or 3rd century CE. Scholars suggest that the inscriptions ended in the 4th century CE because there is no references to Christianity. That's an argument from silence. So basically, we don't know for sure when the inscriptions ended, and we really don't know for sure when they began. But we know that during the Nabatean and Roman periods, writers dated their texts and to events, perhaps major events of the period. That's problematic when we talk about authorship, right? Because if we want to say there was mass literacy, we would like to know how, and there are, let's say, 50,000 texts, we would need to know over how long of a period these 50,000 texts were produced. If 50,000 texts were produced over 1,000 years, then that's not mass literacy. That could be something much more limited. But we'll talk about that after a few slides. The inscriptions themselves in the Oceana corpus. Now, Oceana is the database that I'll be talking about today. It was put together at Oxford University under the direction of Michael MacDonald and Professor Jeremy Johns. And it is a database containing the inscriptions of North Arabia, the ancient North Arabian inscriptions, the ones in these kinds of alphabets, Safaitic, Ismaic, Thamudic, and so on. The Safaitic corpus is 33,617 texts. Now, there's more than 40,000 known texts. They just have not all been inserted into the database yet. The texts are usually considered graffiti. And what do we mean by graffiti? That's very difficult to define. That these are self-authored texts. That if a text contains the name of an individual, this was written by the person who put his name there. This tends to be the operative definition by people working in Ancient North Arabian, that these texts were written by their authors. They were not commissioned. And the subjects, the textual genres, are quite limited. They include signatures. Most of the inscriptions, the vast majority of texts, are just signatures, or we call them signatures. They're people's names, personal names. Sometimes just a single name, sometimes with a lineage of up to 12 generations or more. Right? So it really just depends. You have rock art. You saw a drawing of a camel. Sometimes these images are signed, maybe by the author, maybe by someone else. Prayers, memorial texts, petitions for protection from deities, building inscriptions. So someone might have built a structure and said, okay, this structure belongs to or was built by so-and-so. And then narratives, narrative texts. And these narratives describe activities like pasturing, migrating, patrolling, things that seem to be mundane. And it's this genre, this narrative genre, that led scholars to believe that these texts were sort of records, diaries of people's everyday lives. That is, the nomads out here in the Harra learned an alphabet and sort of wrote about what they were doing in real time, sort of like a diary. So here you have an inscription. It begins with the personal name, by. We translate this as by conventionally. We're not sure if it actually means by in terms of authorship. And then he gives his name, Falatat, son of Mar, son of Ahad, son of Gedalay, son of Abd. So it's several generations. And then a narrative. وَرَعَيَهَا نَخْلَ بِذَكَرْ فَرُطَوْ غَنِيمَتَهَا سَنَتْ وَفَصَاي مِنْ شَانِتْ. Right? So I'm going to read it in my best Safaitic, and you can read the translations. Now, what's interesting for those of you who know Arabic, you can see how close this is to classical Arabic. It's incredible. These texts here are at least, 600-700 years earlier than the grammatical tradition, but very close. So this is basically a person who talks about pasturing in a valley, and then he asks for protection and spoils. right? So it seems like a rather mundane thing. Another here, the guy gives his name and he says, وَرَعْيَ هَضَأْنَا فَهَلَّاتْ سَلَامْ وَعَوْرْ لِذِي يُعَوِّرْ هَالسِّفْرَ وَتَشَوَّقَ إِلَى مَنْ أَخِيهِ فَهَلَّاتْ قِبْلَالْ وَوَجَمَ عَلَى سَرْمَتْ. Again, really pasturing sheep, asking for security, and mentioning that he misses his brother and he wants to be reunited with him. They seem like very mundane texts, really like a diary. Military activities are mentioned too. This individual here, قصص بمئة فرس or فرس بعاد آل طيف فها قد طيف سلام. He patrolled on behalf of this tribe. Why did they write? That's the main question. Looking at texts like this, perhaps the most commonly cited hypothesis is the pastime hypothesis. The idea is that nomads didn't have a practical use for writing. We have no evidence that these nomads were involved in long-distance trade. They wouldn't have kept records of legal records or property. We have no evidence for any of this. It seems that the nomads, and the hypothesis goes like this. It's been, I think it begins with Littman at the beginning of the 20th century, but it's articulated most clearly by the great scholar of North Arabian, Michael MacDonald, that nomads may have gone to an oasis and there would have noticed traders using writing. And they would have asked, what is that? What are you guys doing? And they say, well, it's writing, and here, this is how you do it. Nomad may have learned the system, gone back to the desert, taught it to his friends, and they would have transformed it sort of into a pastime activity. While they're spending hours pasturing their sheep, there's nothing else to do, might as well write. And they wrote. I mean, if you look at the corpus, it seems like they wrote a lot. The texts, in this sense, the texts were purely playful. They served no real function. They were never meant to be read by anybody. So authors could write them in it. We said that they can write them in any different way, back and forth. There doesn't seem to be any, let's say, stable orientation. So scholars said, well, that's evidence that, of course, the texts weren't meant to be read. And there was clearly no schools in the desert. There were no institutions as such to manage the language, so the language must have been learned informally, or at least the writing tradition must have been learned informally, and the large number of texts finally suggests that almost everyone was doing it, or at least all the males, because there's less than 100 inscriptions by women, or at least that contain the word that we translate as by with the female's name in the entire corpus. So it seems to have been primarily a male activity, which makes sense because males were probably the ones pasturing the animals, and they were probably the ones doing the patrolling. So it may have been associated with those activities. Now, it is a compelling hypothesis, but there are problems. We know that that authors did care about their inscriptions. They didn't want them to be destroyed. They wanted them to be read. You have, for example, this beautiful curse on anyone who would destroy the inscription. هَلَّاتْ عَوَرْ وَعَرَقْ وَخَرَصْ وَقَرَبْ وَحَكَكْ لِذِي يُعَوِّرْ هَالسِّفْرَ. Right? And you can get, even more elaborate curses that are not PG. And so, they really wanted people to stay away from their texts. We have examples of people reading texts. And sometimes, after reading the text, they would make a prayer for the person mentioned in the text. وَجَدَ, in the top one here, وَجَدَ أَثْرَهَا أَخْيَرْ فَقَالَ لِآلِهِ هَعُمْرٍ. He found the writing or the traces of this person, Han Akhyar or Hanit, Khair, it's unclear how to render that. And he said, may his people have long life. Right? Or this one is very nice here. وَجَدَ أَثْرَ عَمَّهِ. He found the traces of his grandfather. And his grandfather's name was probably Hamyan. فَقَالَ هَاقَ الضَّيْفِ هَبْلُهِ كَسَعْدِهِ وَكَوَلْدِهِ وَكَنَعَامِهِ. Found the trace of his grandfather and asked for the like of all the wonderful things that the gods bestowed upon his grandfather. So people are interacting with texts. They can read them, and when they read them, they make a prayer. And I would say that most of the time they wouldn't write the prayer they said it aloud. And we only have very few cases in which a person would say, waqala, and he said, and what he said. So texts were meant to be read. You have prayers asking people to read the text. You have prayers protecting the text from destruction, and evidence that the texts are being read. the texts are also incredibly formulaic. Even if the teaching of the alphabet was informal, a lot more went into the production of these texts than simply knowledge of an alphabet. Because if that were the case, we would get all kinds of expressions. In fact, almost all the texts follow this structure. You begin with a lineage. You can put as many generations as you like. Of course, it takes time, so if you have a lot of time, you could put more. Then the narrative, usually some kind of activity. In this case, وَأَشْرَقَ سَنَةْ خَلَاصَتْ, and he migrated to the inner desert the year of Khalasat, maybe an individual. And then a prayer and curse to protect the text and to protect the author. So minimally, we can say people were not only taught the alphabet, they were also taught how to produce a Safaitic inscription. What an inscription was, the structure of it, and what should be contained in it. The narrative has a limited range of themes. They almost never mention good things. They're constantly talking about, if you take it at face value, these were a very, very depressed people. They were only talking, there's no rain. They're talking about migration and military activities, pasturing and wanting protection from predators and from enemies during pasturing, protection from raiders. So they're really focused on negative events. They don't ever or very rarely, of course, you can never say never, but very rarely does anyone talk about good rains, or I don't think we have anything about the birth of children, which would have been, I think, something worth of writing. Weddings, not really. So the texts themselves, even what you could write about, was very limited and very formulaic. It wasn't free expression. It wasn't a diary as such. There's another way. So all of those things, I think, make us think twice about the idea that nomads simply learned an alphabet and produced text to pass the time. But then there's another way we can approach this question. And that is looking at the database where we have all of these inscriptions now in a way that we can study them statistically. How much evidence do we have just at face value from mass literacy? From people, basically the scenario is this: I'm going to write to pass the time while I pasture. Now, a person will pasture for a large part of their life. We have one inscription where a man says he pastured for 25 years. And boredom, of course, the longer you do this, the more bored you're going to get. So I would expect to find this individual all over the corpus. I would want to be able to find him in the landscape, writing his name and different narratives as he moved around and as he pastured. We can only do this test with inscriptions that have more than one name, of course. And so that reduces our corpus to 26,366. Still a large number. Now when we do that, this is what we get. The vast majority of texts, 76%, those individuals appear only once in the entire corpus. That is, we wouldn't be able to say that these individuals were writing their names as they moved around through the landscape. They appear only once in the corpus. Only 24% appear more than once. And about 70% of that 24% only appears twice. So it's not that they're constantly writing their names only appear twice in the corpus so far. And when you move up to 3 generations, let's say this is for 2 generations. If we move to 3, it stays about equal. I mean, it reduces to 19% of repeats, right? So we can say that a minority of if people are really authoring these texts, a minority of individuals are authoring more than one text. So we would have to imagine a scenario that a person learned not only the alphabet, but the incredible amount of skill it takes to carve these texts. They'd look rough from our eye, but the basalt is a hard stone to carve, and it takes a tremendous amount of skill to do this, and you have to plan the text as well in many cases. They would have learned all of this only to produce one inscription. It's a very unlikely scenario. There are some caveats, of course. Most of the areas have not been comprehensively surveyed. Not every stone has been unturned. But in the areas that have been, like a Jawa survey carried out by Michael McDonald, if you look at that corpus, where in this entire, it's quite a large area, several square kilometers, was systematically surveyed and swept the numbers are even lower. So even when, and so we would like to look at, of course, a complete survey of the whole Harra, and with enough manpower that would be possible, but with the manpower we have now, I think it would take hundreds of years. But as it stands, and the corpus does seem representative, the numbers don't really support the idea of individuals moving in the landscape, writing their names as they go around. And the numbers that I presented are probably too high because the database contains a lot of duplicate inscriptions. That is, it contains every published text, but texts have sometimes been published 2 or 3 times. And the study can't really distinguish between a duplicate and the same text published multiple times. And it will take a lot of time to go through the database and fix it so that all of the duplicates, that is the same text that's been published in multiple places, are placed under one card, in one card. So the numbers that I presented are probably a bit lower. Then even if we take the most, let's say that there is 100,000 inscriptions in the Harra, right? So far about 40,000 are known. Let's just make this very generous estimate. There are 100,000 texts out there. And let's say that there's 500 years of activity, epigraphic activity. Is that really a big number? Right? Is it really a big number? If you distribute it evenly over the years, it's not. Right? It's not. It doesn't really argue for everyone being able to write. It suggests maybe a limited group of people, a smaller group of people being able to write at the most. Okay, well, if all of this stands in the way and kind of negates the pastime hypothesis, or let's just say doesn't support the pastime hypothesis, then what did they do all of this for? Right? What was the purpose of the Safaitic inscriptions, if not to pass the time? I mean, you still have to deal with texts that are saying, he pastured the sheep, he pastured the camels, he migrated. What was the reason for that? So I'd like to suggest a revised hypothesis. I would suggest that a small group of people, well, relatively small, just not everyone, learned the skill of how to read and write. They learned the alphabet, and they also learned the technique of carving. And it was passed on informally. Let's say there aren't schools. It was passed on informally from generation to generation. And writing augmented certain pre-existing rituals. We see this especially clearly with a funerary ritual. So when there seems to have been a tradition that when you either when a person dies, you put a stone on the grave, right? And it ends up as a cairn. You either bury the person or put them inside the cairn, but nevertheless you put a stone down, laying a stone on the grave of a dead person. Now this ritual, this ancient ritual, seems to have been augmented by writing in the Safaitic context, where not only would you put the stone, but you would write your name and that you grieved for the dead man or dead person, a dead woman, and then you would put the stone. So the stone was a memorial of the dead, but it was also a memorial of the grief of the living. This ritual was augmented by writing, and I would suggest that various rituals, like prayers when you set off for migrations, sacrifice, these types of rituals ended up being augmented by writing. You would write your prayer for protection during your migration, which was certainly a dangerous affair. When you're pasturing is often followed by prayers for protection and deliverance. Well, of course, because you're at risk from predators, from raiders, it is not a safe thing to go away from your group to pasture animals. Prayers, it makes complete sense that you would put that into writing with a prayer if you think of writing augmenting these kinds of customs. And so in a sense, writing became part of ritual, but connected to these rituals, and we can speak of a writing tradition, right? We already see that there is some kind of tradition considering how formulaic these texts are. And those who could write texts would sometimes write graffiti, and they would sometimes write the names of other people. Here we have a text. It's very clearly these are 3 individuals, and it's very clearly written by one. There's one hand here. So one person wrote the names of 3 individuals. Now, why would they write the names of individuals? Well, I'm sure they're aware as we are. Eventually, any name put onto rock becomes memorial, right? You come across it, you see it, and it reminds you of the person. And at that moment, like we've seen some have said, you may say, may this person be blessed. may this person be remembered. You might make an oral invocation, right? So ultimately, all names on rock, whether the original intent was such, become memorial. Thank you very much.